Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nicholas. We're very pleased to welcome back author Anil Holmes. She has one of the most unusual career paths for a celebrated novelist. She was an accomplished archaeologist and teacher for 25 years. Earlier in her career, she served as a nun for 2 decades. In between, she was an artist and antiques dealer before getting a doctorate in classical Near Eastern archaeology study from Bryn Mawr. She has excavated in Greece and Israel and taught ancient history and humanities at Stockton University in New Jersey and the University of South Florida. Back in April, we had a chance to talk with her about The Sun at Twilight, her latest in her Empire at Twilight series about the Hittite Empire, circa 1300 BCE. Today, we have a look at her other historical fiction series, The Lord Hani Mysteries, set in ancient Egypt. Lake of Flowers is the 4th book in the series and the subject of our talk today. We're pleased to welcome Anil Holmes. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolute delight here. Now, you said you're more interested in character than plot, and Lake of Flowers features an honorable, upright character in Lord Hani, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yet the plot here, will not at a breakneck pace, feels as if it moves in a timely manner from point to point. Maybe a little more catchy than the Hittite Empire stuff, which has very vast movements of great numbers of people. Here you're kind of focusing in on this smaller group and solving a mystery at the same time. Pretty interesting stuff.
Thank you. Yes, this series it's a genre mystery, so it is a little more heavily plotted. But there are also character arcs and larger plot arcs that extend from book to book. But each one has its sort of mystery of the day that gets solved within the covers of one book,
which is really, really intriguing. And you had me guessing too. I didn't come up with the answer until the end and after the reveal. So you win.
Neither did I, Roger.
That's the way it happens sometimes. Indeed. I when looking through this, something struck me, and there's a bird theme that runs all through this book. Lord Hani calls, it has names, bird names actually for his relatives. I mean, he calls one daughter his duckling, the other his swan, his wife his dove. The crown prince is referred to as the haru in the nest. A couple of lines that I really like this analogy here. It says a whole new array of possibilities started unfolding in Hani's mind, like the wet feathers of a hatching bird, getting more and more voluminous until it was impossible to believe he'd just been contained in a tiny egg. What a beautiful phrase. I mean, it's really nice. Yeah. So and you also mentioned, I took notes. Once I started figuring out that birds were good, you mentioned nightingale, ibis, owl, duck, dove, swan, chick, and swallow, as well as the other ones we mentioned. Is this conscious, or is it just flow for, are you a bird watcher as well?
Well, Hani's a bird watcher. That's
right,
the main
right.
thing.
Yeah.
So yes, I do like birds myself, but he's the one whose character is being followed here.
And he has a pet as well, a most unusual pet.
Yes, a heron. One does see herons in domestic settings in Egyptian art, and the Greeks too had pet herons. So I thought that wouldn't be too.
It was nice. I think I only noticed it twice, but both times it jumped out at me because it's interesting. At one point, the heron comes and cocks his head and looks at him and kind of turns and shakes his head and goes away. Kind of almost a commentary, like, I don't know what you're getting into, pal. But I like that. It was a nice touch. How much research do you have to do? Obviously, you're a professional, but you must research specific periods to write these books.
Yes, that's true. I've taught ancient Egypt, but I've never, I'm not an Egyptologist. So despite a certain body of professional knowledge I started out with, I had to do a lot of research. And in fact, you end up with more factoids than you can use. And there is a temptation to try to stuff them all in. Perhaps I'm guilty of that with the first book of this series. But once you've written one book set in the time period, each successive one becomes easier because you become more familiar with the details of daily life.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me, because I'm a coin collector, is that they were using jewelry as money.
Yeah, they had no coins until something like the 5th, 6th century BC.
Yeah, interesting.
Just what they call hock silver, which is just chopped up bits of silver, gold, or bronze.
Mhm.
and they weighed them out by what they call the deben. So they tended to cast metal in rings that weighed a deben. So, I mean, if you want to think of a giant coin that you clip
Mhm.
pieces of, that's kind of what it was.
Ah, interesting. Of course, that's people will notice different things who have different backgrounds. That's just something that appealed to me as a numismatist. Um, there are, I mean, you talk about characters, and I ran into some what I like to call a telling detail, the nice little teeny bit about a character that reveals a great deal. And I'm interested in getting some comments on you. One of the first ones that I picked up was this: Maya liked to be indispensable. I like that. That's really short, and yet that gave you kind of a whole motivation for him.
Now, Maya, to me at least, is an interesting character. He's a dwarf, but he's even more. He's from the working class, and thanks to Hani's patronage, he was able to get scribal training and so mount in the world. Literacy was the key to status in those days. So he's rather insecure about that. Throughout the books, he's thinking people are, looking down on him, figuratively as well as literally, and he's a little bit touchy about that.
Yeah. There's another line in here that it said Maya was still wearing his pen case over his shoulder, reluctant to abandon the symbol of his literacy, even in a crowd composed of literate bureaucrats. That just reinforces that.
Yeah, it's kind of a thing about Maya. I've tried to give him a personality that will play well with Hani.
Very, very interesting. Another one that came to my mind is Pippi was nearly 50, but he was still just a big 10-year-old at heart. And I think we all know people like that.
This is Hani's younger brother who's getting into one scrape after another through his irresponsible behavior from book to book. So I tried to bring him in a little bit. And of course, there's this issue that you have to decide how much backstory you want to give each character who's introduced. Someone who's followed the books from the beginning will know immediately what Pippi's career has been like up to now, but someone just starting with this book will not. So try to
Well,
clue them in a little bit at least.
yeah, and I did start with this book, and it didn't take long to pick it up. So I think you did just the right amount of detail. How much shading, and you can overcolor, but doing this the right amount. And I know that one of the things that they always tell us in writing classes, kill your babies, the phrase you just absolutely love but doesn't really fit, let it go. Knowing what not to print sometimes is a wisdom.
Yes, that's exactly true. It's the music is between the notes, as
Yeah,
somebody said.
yeah. And then I'm going to try this one. Marriott Atten, uh,
Mhm.
the sweet-faced girl was a relentless predator. There's that tension back and forth between those two aspects. I like that.
Yeah, she's kind of an interesting character. We don't know anything about her personality, only that she was the youngest, the eldest daughter of Akhenaten, and she became his queen after he made his wife Nefertiti a king.
Yeah.
So after his death, she becomes her mother's wife. That is for ceremonial purposes. And there's speculation that she was agitating for the throne and trying to even to draw a bridegroom from the Hittite Empire and to consolidate her place on the throne. So this whole period after Akhenaten and before Tutankhamun is little known, and there's lots of room for novelists to step in, spin away.
A really good sandbox for people to play in at this
Yes,
point,
yes.
yes, as it were. What's the other thing I had laid down here? Oh, oh, there's one line where Hani could have spanked his daughter Nefret, who was ever ready to spill any secret to draw any attention to herself. And that's pretty revealing too.
Nefret is a kind of people's favorite character, I think, to some extent. She starts out a child with the first book, and by this time she's 23, I believe. She is a lesbian, strangely enough, but she's one of the palace physicians, since the king is a woman now, and also the physician of the king, Nefertiti's eldest daughter, Marriott.
Mhm.
So she has kind of a pipeline to palace gossip, and she's not afraid to use it.
No, and that comes in handy, certainly, in
Helps
piecing.
helps me in plotting, that's for sure.
Well, also she has a marriage to another fascinating character.
She's this is sort of her cover as she marries her father's best friend, who is a high aristocrat, who's has sort of an odd character. I mean, he's a very sort of uptight, proper. He was originally struggling with his conscience, trying to remain loyal during this upheaval that Akhenaten brought with him. But finally, after his wife, who was quite a wild-eyed rebel against Akhenaten, after she was murdered, he sort of loses his inhibitions and jumps into the fight. But because he had lost his wife recently and under terrible conditions, he's sort of, never gonna touch another woman, that sort of thing. And obviously Nefret has no interest in touching a man, so it seemed like a good cover for them both.
It's really nicely to work that in, and it's not obvious at first, but it suddenly dawns on, if you haven't read the previous books, it suddenly dawned on me, okay, that's very interesting. And people do rich combinations like that. So that's why. Yeah, well, let's see. I'm whirling through I take notes as I read. So I'm scrolling down through my list. We have not talked about the religious aspects behind a lot of this and the hidden one and whatnot. How did that play out in reality? And did you have to twist it to make it work for your novel at all?
Well, fortunately, the historical reality was dramatic enough that I didn't have to do anything but sort of insert the personal parts into it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this series begins with Akhenaten's arrival on the throne, and he was quite a revolutionary. He overthrew, gradually, but not very gradually, overthrew the cult of Amun-Ra, aka the Hidden One, and pretty nearly suppressed the cult of all the traditional Egyptian gods in exchange for this single god, the Aten, who was probably actually his father. And he was the one priest in all of this. And, moderns being monotheists sometimes look back at him and think, gee, the first monotheist, what a guy.
Mm.
But Egyptologists or anybody who had studied him just find him an appalling person. And he just ruined the economy of the country by destroying these priesthoods, which were vast, and the temples were holders of great land. And so, all of that falls to the ground. These thousands, tens of thousands of people suddenly without work. And there was even persecution, and that's very unusual for Egyptian history. There was sort of, probably not by him personally, but by his eager followers. People were chiseling their families' names off the walls of their tombs, which happens to Hani at the beginning of the series. That was the equivalent of killing their soul forever. It was a terribly hostile act. So there must have been enormous tensions, and certainly during Akhenaten's life, but especially afterwards, there was a lot of resistance, and the priests of Amun-Ra in particular would have been chafing at the bit to get their power back. So that tension, that sort of simmering revolution, is a backstory to all of these volumes, and it gets pretty tense by this one, and then will conclude in the subsequent volume when Tutankhamun comes to the throne and things start reversing for good.
Just being able to plan and think in these big arcs. By now, you probably got the ending of the last book already nailed down and just filling in the pieces, right?
Only the historical part precedes the writing. I'm a pantser, as they say, someone who writes as I go. I mean, I don't plot in advance. So, I mean, I have in mind a few things that I want to happen, but as far as the continuing arc from book to book, I'm following, not leading. It sounds corny, I know, but the characters are in charge.
You have to do what works for you, and obviously this works for you very nicely. So, very pleased to hear that. see, I'm rolling down some other stuff here. Oh, the crocodiles. I thought that was an unusual. Was that really, were they named that, or did that something you came up with?
No, that's Hani's term. In the second book, which is called The Crocodile Makes No Sound, he likens the simmering discontent, the sort of revolutionary party, to a crocodile which is under the water and yet cruising along, and sometime soon is going to break out and bite you. So the idea of the hidden opposition, and he retains that term. It's nothing we actually find in historical documents.
But it seems appropriate. It fits, I guess, and that's
Yeah.
in one of the interesting things about reading is you learn stuff. Also, the white scarf of mourning. In some
Well,
countries,
this is semi-historical, and
yeah,
like so many elements of daily life, I've had to make them up because we just don't know.
yeah.
But this idea comes from the wall paintings in the tomb of Tutankhamun, where the men who were the pallbearers, sledging the coffin of the king to his burial place, are shown with white scarves around their head. And
Mhm.
elsewhere in funeral scenes, we see red scarves and no scarves at all. So it's hard to know exactly what that meant, but I've chosen to make it more universal.
Okay, because I know in some Oriental countries, white is a symbol of death. So it's not uncommon that way.
No, I don't know if any one color had a connotation with death, but
Mhm.
sometimes you see in funeral scenes in Egypt, women dressed in professional mourners dressed in black. So possibly that had some funereal connotations to them too. Their
Mhm.
ordinary clothes were white, of course, so
Mhm.
that couldn't have been totally significant of death.
Yeah. I just we've not talked about the title of the book, and it refers to the beautiful lake that the blessed soul will cross to enter the field of reeds. And I'm just wondering if there is some sort of, I may be stretching this, but comparison to the river Styx, a body of water you cross over to get to the ultimate destination.
Yeah, I don't think there is any particular borrowing going on here, but it's kind of a universal uh, human way of conceiving the afterlife. I mean, in many cultures, including the Hittites, if you're calling up the dead, they have to cross over running water to be able to reappear on Earth. So I guess just the idea of a separation like that.
Hmm.
And for the Egyptians, as for many people in the past, their afterlife was modeled on the world they knew. So that big old river goes right up through the middle of everything, and people lived on the east bank for the most part and were buried on the west bank. So the idea of crossing over water
Mm.
was something that was very real to them.
Okay, and there is a point at which they're moving where they're going to put people after they die from the one bank to the other bank, and that's a signifier as well of changing times.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Akhenaten, for, well, complex reasons,
Hmm.
when he built his new capital, Akhenaten, it was in a kind of a bay in the desert on the east bank. And there was a row of cliffs around it, as there so often are along the Nile Valley. And in the cliffs, there was a notch, which to him looked like a hieroglyph for horizon. So he named the city the Horizon of the Aten, Akhet Aten. And if you go through that, heading east into the desert, through that notch, there's kind of a valley with a possibility of burial places. And so that's where he and his court were buried. And that was completely contrary to the whole vision of the afterlife and the meaning of the West, sailing into the West and stuff
Hmm.
that the Egyptians traditionally held. And so that was probably upsetting for them as well.
Just when you talk about going to the West, I might think of Lord of the Rings.
Yes, yes.
Uh,
Or Oregon for that matter.
yeah, there you go.
Paradise.
Yes, yes. Interesting indeed. Um, I don't want to give too much away, but there is an interesting mineral that plays a part in here. And I didn't know about it. And I had to look it up because I didn't, but it's a very real thing. And it plays a part in it for its property other than what it's used for. And
Oh, the metal. Ah,
yeah,
yes. How much can I say?
yeah.
I had never heard about it until I excavated in Crete. And one day we found a big vase, and the pottery man was jumping all over. I think there's orpiment in the bottom. So, I think it turned out not to be, but that got me all curious, and so I went out and found out what that was and what its potential uses plot could be.
Yeah, yeah.
I
I
say
think
no more.
no, exactly, exactly. But again, I was delighted to find that out, and when I checked it out, I said, "Oh, okay, I see how that fits in." Again, we as artists, you bring all your life experiences to the table when you start writing, and uh, you never know what piece is going to come in handy.
True, true.
Yeah.
You could have used many pigments that we still use. I mean, they all have this
Mhm.
particular property to some extent.
Yeah. This may be just a similarity in names, but Maya in the Hindu religion, Maya is devoted to the magic power with which a god can make human beings believe in what turns out to be an illusion. I'm sure that's not probably what you put the name in there for, but I found that an intriguing resonance.
Yeah, that is interesting. I can't imagine what real cultural contact Egypt and India would have had,
Mhm.
but some things seem to be universal. And in Egyptian, the word Mai means lion,
Mm.
and so Maya is kind of a cute nickname for any word that ends in this, uh, theophoric names, that is, names of a god that
Mhm.
mean such and such a god gives birth to. So Amenmes, which is Maya's real name, uh, Thomas, who takes the nickname Maya as well. So it was a pretty commonly found name. If it had a particular meaning other than something to do with lions, I'm not aware.
Okay, interesting. Just again, I'm bouncing some of my own personal stuff around
Oh
with
no,
this.
it's fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, and every person who reads the books are going to get different things out of them, and it's kind of intriguing as well. I also had to look up the word fanfaronade, which I love.
Well,
You send me the dictionary, I'm a happy guy.
well, some people agree with you and others don't.
Yeah,
I guess I hang out in France too much, so kind of a francophone vocabulary creeps in from time to time.
right. And the meaning I discovered is arrogant or boastful talk. I'm going to be using. I'll file the serial numbers off and use that as my own down the road.
Well, words are wonderful. I used to spend my time as a child while the others were watching TV. I would lie on my stomach and read the dictionary. So the idea of there being just the right word for what I'm trying to say is very attractive.
And in English is the perfect language for it. We have so many ways to say the same thing, and other which baffles people trying to learn the language from
Yeah,
simpler
yeah, that's true.
backgrounds. Yeah. Um, let's see. There's a line in here that also seemed to just sum up the human condition. You say the gods bestow their gifts without distinction of class and wealth. And we're speaking particularly of a young, good-looking lady who's not of the highest class, and so that was kind of interesting to see that randomness come out, and which does happen in life.
Of course, Hani is slightly countercultural. I mean, Egyptian society was very hierarchical,
Mm.
and there was, uh, you actually had a different soul if you were low class or high class or royal. And then the gods had a soul too, which was divine. So he is perhaps a little more like us in that he kind of sees through that and appreciates the value of individuals for themselves. But without giving anything away, let's just say it turns out this girl has reason to resemble the queen.
Oh yes, yeah. There are again. This is sort of a police procedural in one way, in one aspect of it, and trying to think of detecting without taking fingerprints or DNA samples or any of that sort of thing, working on psychology and knowledge alone. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, this is what attracted me. People are often say to me, "Why don't you write a modern mystery?" And I think I'm not about to tackle all that high forensic stuff that's going on now. I know nothing about it.
Mhm.
But if you think about all the centuries and millennia that preceded all of that, people had to use their brains purely
Mhm.
and, just ask questions and look for physical clues that might cue them in.
Yeah.
So that route I took, and certainly if they investigated murders in the old days, this is the way they did it.
Yeah, and one thing I'm sure that if I were back there, I'd want to have a ship because some of those ships sounded really cool.
Oh yeah, well, we don't think of Egypt as being a maritime country, but on the other hand, it's nothing but the river valley. So
Mm.
every place they went was by boat. So it was an extremely, what shall I say, boat-oriented society, and they did have seagoing vessels as well. Of course, they sailed up and down the Mediterranean. But I wouldn't have known anything about Egyptian boats, not being a boat person, unless I had taught about that in my
Mhm.
class. So I had to do a little research. It's really fascinating, and they were so sophisticated in their boat building and created different vessels for different kinds of uses. For example, to carry an obelisk
Yeah,
from the quarry to the place where it was going to be erected. What kind of boat do you have to design for a piece like that? But they managed it.
yeah, and it just reminds me of the what they call the super guppy, which was the giant plane that would deliver parts from one place to the other of for the space shuttle. And it looks like a plane is suddenly a big swollen part in the middle of it. So
Oh yeah, I think I've seen pictures of that.
yeah, so we have done that as well, but again, uh, it happened long before we thought of it too. Um, are you still teaching at all? Doing any?
I'm not.
Uh-huh.
I'm completely retired from the university scene. And of course, everyone asks, don't you miss it? And I have to say no, much as I enjoyed it when I was doing it, much
Mhm.
as I loved, being around the students and seeing their enthusiasm, I feel like what I'm doing now by writing historical novels is pretty much the same thing. So I guess I'm getting the same the same feedback, more indirectly perhaps, but it's still a matter for me of helping people to understand that the people of the past were just like us. They were human nature has not changed, although religions have and technology has and costumes have. They had the same emotional responses to what happened in their lives. So I think, to that extent, we can understand them and the
Mhm.
choices they made.
That's absolutely. We tend to forget. We look back through very narrow lenses and pick out the things we want, not realizing that there's a wide panoply of things there to look at. So, but that's the novelist's job as well, is to pick out the telling details that indicate the larger picture.
Mhm.
So, it just occurred to me that with your background in instruction, do you ever think about teaching a writing seminar for people?
Well, no, I mean, I consider myself a sort of newbie when it comes to writing. I mean, I've had no formal training, just from reading myself all my life and from reading books about writing and going to conferences and
Mhm.
webinars. I do blog for the Florida Writers Association every month, which
Good.
is just a little short something about the art of writing, mostly things that I've learned. Um, but as far as presenting myself as somebody who can, you know, teach anyone else this subject, I don't know. And perhaps my method of writing is a little unconventional too. So
Mhm.
all
But
I can do is offer people encouragement and hope that they'll stick with it because that's what it takes.
oh, absolutely. What's one of the authors says you have to take your seat and apply it to the chair and in front of the
Yep,
keyboard
yep.
and don't stop. Or I think one of my other favorite quotes is like somebody like Harlan Ellison said, you just sit down at the typewriter and open a vein. It's what it does.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like that.
like that. Is there any aspect that we have not touched on that you would like to make sure that our listeners understand?
Well, I don't know, except people have asked, where is this going? How many more
Mhm.
books will there be? There's at least one more, and I think that will probably finish up the Lord Honey mysteries. But
Mhm.
then I'd like to do a prequel because, especially in the earlier books, there are references to events that precede the series.
Ah,
Uh, Real diplomatic missions of the real Honey, for
mhm.
example. And I think I'd like to dip back into that. At the moment, I'm writing some serial novels for, well, I have a contract with a publisher to do them in this format, which is new. Amazon's starting this Vela format, which is
Mm, yeah.
a little snippets book that you can buy daily or weekly or whatever. And, you
Oh,
know, you get a whole novel, but
in
dribbled out to you.
in
So
pieces.
it's an interesting experience. I'm using the other series, however, because
Mm,
they're much less interconnected,
yeah.
and I tends to be to miss out if they're not willing to go with me to the new
Well,
format.
that is great. I think we can wrap up here at this point. I just want to suggest to everyone that even if you haven't read but go out and get all of them, because it'll give you the background to understand this even better. If you even haven't done that, do grab a copy of Lake of Flowers in Holmes, and we hope that you will return when book 5 comes out so we can find out how it ends.
Be happy to do that.
Thank you. Okay, you did well, as always, and I hope the questions were enough interesting to keep you going on this stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah, very thought provoking. Thank you.
All right, well, and I wish you well. I will get this posted up and get a link to Grace so I can get it to you, so that and again, you're more than welcome to use any of this stuff on your own website.
I do try to, push the post ahead on everywhere,
Yeah.
so you get something out of it too.
All right. Well, thanks so much again, and keep up the excellent work.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk to you.
You bet. Take care.